I pulled into my driveway in Decatur that evening and knew immediately something was catastrophically wrong. My 7-year-old daughter Emma wasn't waiting at the front window the way she always did on Thursdays when I worked the double shift at Mercy General. The porch light was on, which meant someone was home, but the front door was shut in a way that felt deliberate, closed off, locked in a way that homes shouldn't close themselves to the people who live inside them. My phone had been dead for the last 6 hours. I'd locked it in my locker at work that morning. Something I almost never did. Something I only ever did on days when I couldn't afford distractions, when I needed to be completely focused on what was happening in the intensive care unit. I didn't know that this would be the one day it mattered more than any other. I didn't know my daughter had been trying to reach me since 2 p.m. The rain coming down was October rain, the kind that doesn't fall gently in the Atlanta area. It comes sideways, angry and deliberate, soaking through everything it touches without mercy. My car tires were still wet when I pulled the key from the ignition. I walked up to the porch slowly, thinking maybe my mother had changed something. Maybe the locks needed to be jiggled. Maybe there was an explanation that would make sense once I heard it. But then I saw her. I saw my daughter Emma sitting on the top step of the porch with her school backpack pulled over her shoulders like a shield, like if she could just hold it tight enough, she could protect herself from something that had already hurt her. She wasn't crying when I saw her. She had already used up all the tears she had. They dried on her cheeks hours earlier, leaving thin lines in the dirt there. Her lips had turned a pale, almost purple-blue from the cold. Her white sneakers, the ones I'd bought her just last month at Target, had turned gray from sitting in a puddle that stretched across the porch boards. She looked small, smaller than I'd ever seen her look before. "Mommy," she said, and her voice cracked on that single word. Something in my chest cracked with it. "The key doesn't work," she whispered. I tried it like you showed me. I called you so many times, but my phone died. Mom, where were you?" I felt my stomach drop through the floor. I pulled my phone out of my coat pocket with shaking hands and stared at the black screen. 6 missed calls. All from her. All from a phone that had given up trying to reach me an hour before I even clocked out. I didn't answer her right away. I couldn't. I walked past her up the porch steps and tried the door myself. The lock turned smoothly, the mechanism wasn't broken. But nothing happened. The door didn't open. I pulled harder. Still nothing. I knocked, and the porch light flickered, and then the door swung open from inside. My mother stood there wearing her cream-colored cardigan, the expensive one she'd bought herself for her birthday, holding a glass of red wine in her hand. Behind her, in the hallway, my sister Caroline was leaning against the wall, scrolling through her phone like this was just any other evening, like the weather outside wasn't turning my child into a statue. Past both of them, I could see into the living room. Caroline's 2 kids were sprawled across the couch with their feet up on the cushions, watching television with the volume turned loud. On the coffee table, folded with strange, deliberate care, was a quilt. The blue quilt my father had sewn before he died. The one Emma had added small, crooked stars to when he taught her basic stitching. The one he told her had the best stars he'd ever seen. The quilt was sitting there like a piece of forgotten laundry, like a thing that didn't matter. Past the living room, through the garage door, I could see them clearly. Black garbage bags lined up against the wall like soldiers. My work uniforms. Emma's school clothes. Everything we owned that I hadn't taken to my bedroom was being removed, already zip-tied shut, already decided about. "You changed the locks," I said. My mother took a slow sip of her wine before answering me. She didn't rush. She didn't seem bothered. "It was time," she said, "for a fresh start." "She's been out here for 4 hours in the rain," I said. "She's 7 years old. She's sitting on a porch in October and she can't feel her fingers anymore." "Children are resilient," my mother said. "Children bounce back from everything. She's fine." She wasn't fine. I could feel her trembling behind me. I could feel her small hands reaching for mine, cold enough to shock my system. I looked past my mother at Caroline, waiting for something: acknowledgement, shame, some sign that another adult in that house understood what had just happened. Caroline glanced up from her phone for just a second, shrugged, and went back to scrolling. "We voted," my mother said, lifting her chin the way she used to when she was announcing that dinner was ready. "Both of us. Caroline and I have decided this arrangement isn't working anymore. This isn't your home anymore, Margaret. We voted." I want to pause here for just a second because I need you to understand something. She didn't say "I think it's best" or I've decided, or I don't feel comfortable with this. She said we voted. As though fairness and democracy applied to locking a child outside in October rain. As though a child's safety was subject to a household vote. And honestly, when I first heard this in my own head, I thought I was going to lose it. I thought I was going to scream, to cry, to beg, to demand an explanation that would somehow make this make sense. But my daughter was standing right there. She was 7 years old, and she was watching to see what a woman does when someone tries to erase her. So I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't beg. Instead, I heard myself say something that seemed to confuse my mother more than any argument could have. Okay, I said calmly. I understand. That single word understood seemed to throw her off balance entirely. She'd been braced for something else, prepared for a fight, ready for me to argue or cry or demand things. What she got instead was stillness. What she got was a woman who had just made a decision that she wouldn't explain to her right now. Because I already knew something she didn't. I already knew about the folder sitting in the bottom drawer of my dresser at home. I already knew about the phone call I'd received 6 days earlier. And I already knew that calm sometimes sounds like surrender, but it can actually sound like certainty. Let me take you back. 6 days before that porch, before the rain, before my daughter's lips turned blue, I got a call from Walter Beaumont, my father's attorney. His office was in Midtown, in one of those buildings with marble floors, and the kind of air conditioning that costs more than some people's monthly rent. I thought he was calling about taxes or insurance or one of the loose ends that trails behind a death for longer than anyone expects. Instead, he asked me to come to his office. He asked me to come alone. I sat across from him in a room lined with leather binders and the steady hum of a window unit working too hard against the Atlanta heat. He slid a folder across the desk to me, thick and official, with the weight of something important. His expression was careful, caught somewhere between caution and relief. Your father, he said slowly, made certain arrangements during his final year. When he was still clear-minded, when he could still think about what might happen after he was gone. My father had been sick for almost 2 years before he died. He was a surgeon, brilliant and stubborn, impossible to convince that he needed help with anything. But his body decided the argument for him. He spent his final months moving through our house like a ghost, sleeping more than he was awake, moving slower and slower until one morning he just didn't wake up. During that year, I worked 12-hour shifts at Mercy General as an ICU nurse. I came home and made dinner. I tracked his medications in a small notebook I kept by his bed. I wrote down every dose, every side effect, every change in his breathing, because I'd seen too many families lose the important details after someone died, and I refused to be one of them. Every evening I sat with him for at least an hour before bed. I held his hand. I listened to him talk about when he was young, before medicine became a business, before he understood that people could be cruel. On weekends, Emma would sit next to him doing homework she didn't actually need help with, just so she'd have a reason to be near him. They'd sit together in quiet, and he'd pretend to grade her math while his eyes closed, and she'd cover him with blankets without waking him, and I'd watch them and think this was love in its clearest form. My mother was different. She'd sit with my father for an hour in the evenings, make his tea, check on him once, and consider herself done. My sister Caroline visited on weekends when it was convenient, arriving with her kids and leaving before bedtime, before the parts of caregiving that were actually difficult, before the parts where you had to watch someone you loved become smaller every single day. When my father died, something shifted in the house. Not just because he was gone, but because my mother seemed to resent that I had been the one taking care of him. She seemed to interpret my presence as a judgment against her. Within 2 months, she converted his study into a playroom for Caroline's kids. His reading chair, the one Emma used to curl into beside him, ended up in the garage under a plastic sheet. His photographs came down off the walls. Everything that reminded the house of who had been loved in it was being systematically removed. I told myself it was grief. I told myself time would help. I made excuses for weeks while things got worse, not better. Emma's school projects started disappearing. I'd find things in the recycling bin that she'd spent weeks creating. I'd ask my mother about it gently, trying not to sound accusatory, and she'd wave her hand and say Emma was too sensitive, that she needed to learn the world didn't revolve around her. Slowly, I realized my mother hadn't been angry at me taking care of my father. She was angry that I had been present for something she wasn't, and she was taking it out on my daughter. Your father knew, Walter said, pulling me back to that leather chair in his office. He knew how your mother was treating you. He watched it happen, and he was unable to stop it while he was alive, so he made sure it could be stopped after he was gone. I opened that folder with shaking hands. Inside were documents I hadn't expected. A revised living trust dated 14 months before his death, created when he was still sharp enough to understand exactly what he was signing. A letter from his physician certifying his mental competency on the exact day he signed. A handwritten letter addressed to me, folded into thirds in my father's careful handwriting, each word still deliberate, despite the shakiness that had crept in during his illness. The trust had specific conditions. The house couldn't be sold, it couldn't be altered, and most importantly, it couldn't be used to exclude or harm either Emma or me. If those conditions were violated, the trust had a transfer clause that would move complete ownership to me and Emma. My mother would have to vacate within 30 days. And all of this had been set up 14 months before he died, way back when he was still healthy enough to understand that something needed protecting. I can't act on suspicion, Walter explained. As trustee, I need documented evidence. But what you described to me, the locks, the exclusion, the belongings in garbage bags, that's exactly what the trust was designed to prevent. That's a documented violation. And once I formally serve notice, it becomes binding. It can't be undone. I opened the handwritten letter. My father's handwriting was shaky, but the words were crystal clear. He wrote about watching me take care of him that year. He wrote about noticing things about me that I hadn't noticed about myself. He wrote that I absorbed unfairness without complaint, that I made myself smaller so other people could feel bigger. He wrote that he hoped this document would never need to be used. But he also wrote that he'd watched my mother treat me as an afterthought for years, and he refused to let that pattern outlive him. And then he wrote something that made me cry in Walter's office, something I've read 100 times since. I know you'll give them every chance before you use this. That's exactly who you are and exactly why I trust you with it. Just promise me you won't wait so long that Emma pays the price for your patience. I sat in that office and felt something shift in my chest. Not triumph, not anger, just clarity. My father, even while his body was failing, even while he was dying, had seen clearly enough to protect us from something the rest of the family couldn't admit they were capable of. When can we do this? I asked. Whenever you're ready, Walter said. There's no rush on my end, but I'd advise not waiting too long. The longer a violation sits unaddressed, the more complicated it gets if she tries to argue you accepted the arrangement. So there I was, 6 days later, standing in the rain with my daughter shaking in my arms, and my mother telling me we'd been voted out, and I said okay. I said understood. And I watched the confusion flicker across my mother's face, because she'd been expecting a different woman entirely. I wrapped my arm around Emma's shoulders and walked her to the car without another word. In the rearview mirror, the porch light got smaller and smaller until the house disappeared into the darkness behind us. We drove through Atlanta in silence. Emma fell asleep with her backpack clutched against her chest, like she needed to know at least one thing couldn't be taken from her overnight. That first night we stayed with Priscilla, a nurse I worked with, who didn't ask a single question when I showed up at 11 at night with a soaked, shaking child and 2 overnight bags. She just handed us towels and made hot chocolate and set up the pull-out couch without judgment. Emma fell asleep immediately, and I sat on the floor beside the couch until sunrise, staring at the ceiling, running through every conversation I could have had, every moment I could have stood up differently. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, Emma stirred in her sleep and murmured something I couldn't quite hear. I leaned closer. "Key doesn't fit," she whispered while dreaming. And I stayed there until her breathing steadied, thinking about all the ways a child's mind tries to make sense of cruelty. The next morning, I called in sick to my shift, something I almost never do. I sat at Priscilla's kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee in front of me, while Emma watched cartoons on mute, too unsettled to focus on sound. I called Walter and told him everything. The locks, the porch, the 4 hours, the quilt folded on the coffee table like garbage. Every detail, every word my mother had said. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. "Bring the folder," he said finally. "Bring all of it. And don't tell your mother or your sister anything. Not one word. Not yet." Over the next 3 days, I did something most people wouldn't have done in my situation. I waited. I went back to work. I dropped Emma at school. I signed her up for an after-school program closer to Priscilla's apartment. I let the stillness stretch out. The same stillness my mother had mistaken for surrender on that porch. On the second day, my mother texted me, "Are you being dramatic on purpose? Come get your things properly instead of hiding." I stared at that message for a long time before locking my phone without responding. That was her chance, and she failed to understand what was happening. On the second night, I sat Emma down and explained in terms an 11-year-old could hold without being frightened that her grandfather had left some instructions a long time ago to make sure we always had a safe place to live, and those instructions were about to matter. She listened carefully and asked only one question. "Is Grandma going to be mad at you?" "Probably," I said honestly. "But being mad doesn't mean she's right." She nodded slowly like she was filing that away somewhere important and went back to drawing. That one moment, that one sentence, shifted something between us. She stopped seeing what happened as her fault. On the third day, I drove back to the house with Walter Beaumont sitting beside me, a single sealed envelope resting on his lap. The rain had stopped, but the porch boards still held that dull damp shine from days before. It felt strange walking up those same steps sober and steady, without a soaked child clutching my hand, without hours of cold behind me. Walter knocked. My mother opened the door wearing that same cream cardigan, clearly expecting to see me alone, ready for another round of what she thought would be pleading. Instead, she saw a man in a gray suit holding an envelope with a law firm's letterhead printed across the corner. Caroline appeared behind her almost immediately, phone already raised, filming the way she always did whenever she sensed something she could use against me later. She had no idea she was about to record her own undoing. "Marilyn," Walter said evenly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had delivered difficult news more times than he could count, "I have a legal notice regarding the property trust established by Richard. Your husband's trust." My mother's expression flickered. Confusion first, then irritation. "A notice about what?" "Richard's been dead for 2 years. Whatever paperwork needed handling was handled a long time ago." "Not all of it," Walter said. "I'd recommend you read this before saying anything further." She took the envelope like it was an inconvenience. She tore it open carelessly. I watched her lips move as she scanned the first paragraph, the way people do when they're trying to convince themselves that the words don't mean what they clearly mean. I watched her face change in real time. The irritation melted into disbelief. The disbelief hardened into something pale and stunned. Her hand began to tremble slightly, enough that a few drops of red wine slipped over the rim of her glass and landed on the porch boards, dark against gray wood. "This isn't real," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He wouldn't have done this. Not without telling me." "It's very real," Walter said. His voice had become something different, the voice of a man who wasn't negotiating anymore. "Richard set up this trust 14 months before he died, when he was mentally competent, when he understood exactly what he was signing. Every clause is enforceable. Every signature is properly witnessed and notarized. Your husband anticipated what might happen, and he made arrangements to prevent it." He paused, letting the weight of that land. "What you described to Margaret, the locks, the exclusion, the removal of belongings from a minor's living space, that constitutes a documented violation of the trust's core protective clause. Under the terms Richard established, I have a legal obligation to enforce his instructions. This notice triggers the transfer clause effective immediately. Within 30 days, ownership of this property transfers to Margaret and Emma. You will be required to vacate." The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever stood inside. It was the kind of silence that has weight. My mother looked at me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, she looked genuinely afraid. Not of losing an argument, not of being embarrassed, afraid of losing something she had assumed could never be taken. "You planned this," she said, her voice cracking at the edges. "You've been sitting on this the whole time, waiting to humiliate me." "No," I said evenly. "My father planned this, years ago. I just waited until I didn't have a choice anymore. I gave you 3 days after that night on the porch to reach out, to apologize, to say one honest thing. You texted me to come get my things. That was your chance." Caroline's mouth opened and closed. She was still holding her phone, but she'd stopped filming. The recording she thought would protect her was actually evidence against her. "This is insane," my mother said. "You can't just take a house because of one bad night." "It wasn't one bad night," I said, and for the first time since standing on that porch, I let a little of what I'd been holding show in my voice. It was 2 years of being treated like an inconvenience. And then it was my daughter sitting outside in the rain for 4 hours because neither of you thought that mattered enough to stop what you were doing. My father thought it would matter. That's the only reason this document exists. Inside the house, Caroline's children's laughter drifted faintly from the living room. They had no idea that the ground beneath them had just shifted permanently. You can have an attorney review the trust if you'd like, Walter continued. But Richard was thorough. Every date is correct. Every signature is witnessed. Every clause is designed to withstand exactly this kind of challenge. My mother didn't say anything else. She just stood there holding the notice, reading it over and over like the words might change if she looked hard enough. Caroline was pale. For the first time in 2 years, she looked genuinely unsure of herself. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stood there and let the weight of the document speak for itself, the same way I had let one word speak for itself 3 days earlier on that porch, the same way my father had let his actions speak for themselves, all the way from beyond death. The 30 days that followed were calmer than our family had ever been. My mother called twice, both times attempting some version of an apology that centered more on her own embarrassment than on Emma's suffering. The first voicemail was mostly about how humiliating it had been to have Walter show up in front of the neighbors. The second was shorter and colder, informing me that her attorney had reviewed the trust and found no loopholes. Richard had been that thorough. Every detail was airtight. Caroline sent messages. First, defensive. I just went along with it. I didn't mean for things to go that far. Then accusatory. You're tearing the family apart over one misunderstanding. I didn't respond to either. I was learning that not answering could be its own complete sentence. On the 30th day, I stood in the driveway of the house again, this time with a moving truck beside me. My mother and Caroline's family had already gone, relocated to a rental across town, taking with them the furniture that was legally theirs and leaving behind the rest. The bright plastic playhouse was still sitting in the garage, unplugged and silent. Emma walked up the porch steps first this time. She pulled her key from her pocket and pushed it into the lock without hesitation. It turned smoothly. The door opened under her own hand. She stood there for just a second, staring at the empty space where her grandfather's photograph used to be, buried in that corner where no one would notice it unless they were looking. Then she opened her backpack and pulled out a small framed picture she'd somehow rescued weeks earlier without telling me. She walked to that same spot on the wall and set it gently back where it belonged, adjusting it twice until it was perfectly straight. There, she said softly. Now it looks right again. I stood behind her in that hallway and felt something settle in my chest for the first time in weeks. The ground beneath our feet was finally solid. That night, after the boxes were mostly unpacked, and the blue quilt was back on Emma's bed where it belonged, she looked up at me and asked the question I'd been waiting for since that night on the porch. Do you think Grandma will ever say sorry? Like really mean it? I thought about it honestly before answering, because she deserved honesty more than comfort. Maybe someday, I said. But you don't have to wait around for it to feel okay again. You already are okay. That was never something she got to decide. She nodded slowly, pulling the quilt tighter around her shoulders. And for the first time in weeks, I watched her fall asleep, without clutching her backpack like a shield. I sat beside her for a long while after that, listening to the steady hum of a house that finally felt like ours in every way that mattered. Not just on paper, but in the way the air settled, the way the porch light stayed on without needing permission. Here's what I understand now that I didn't understand before. Some people believe love means tolerating anything, staying silent, keeping the peace even when the peace was never fair to begin with. I used to believe that too. I'd stay quiet to keep the harmony. I'd make myself smaller so other people could feel bigger. But then I watched my daughter shiver on a porch because 2 grown women decided her comfort was optional. And I realized something crucial. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do isn't to forgive immediately. It's to protect what matters more than peace. My father spent his final year making sure that when this moment came, we would be protected. And I spent 3 days making sure his intentions actually mattered. We didn't raise our voices. We didn't need to. Sometimes the loudest answer to cruelty is a single word delivered calmly, while the real answer is already on its way, in a sealed envelope. Emma still keeps her key on a small keychain, shaped like a star that she picked out herself the week we moved back in. She doesn't grip it the way she used to, white-knuckled like it might stop working at any moment. Some evenings she sits in her grandfather's old reading chair, the one I pulled out of the garage and had reupholstered. The blue quilt with her crooked stars drapes over her knees, and I catch myself thinking that maybe this is what he actually wanted all along. Not revenge. Not to punish anyone. Just a home that couldn't be taken away from people who never stopped showing up for it. A safe place that was legally, emotionally, and morally theirs. I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly. If you had been me on that porch that night, seeing your child shaking in the cold, hearing your mother say those words, would you have said understood and waited? Would you have trusted in a document you hadn't even fully opened yet? Or would you have done something completely different in that moment? Because the truth is, the woman I was before this story, and the woman I became through it are two different people. One was waiting for permission. The other had already decided that protection mattered more than politeness. So here's what I'm asking. Are you waiting for permission in your own life? Are you making yourself smaller so someone else can feel bigger? Or have you already decided that the people you love deserve better than tolerance, better than silence, better than the kind of peace that costs them everything? Leave a comment below and tell me what you would have done. Tell me what decision is sitting in front of you right now that you're afraid to make. And if this story resonated with you, if you found yourself in Margaret's shoes or Emma's shoes, or even in that moment where you have to choose between fighting or staying calm, I want you to subscribe to this channel. Because the next story I'm going to tell you involves a woman who stayed silent for 15 years, and the single phrase that made her finally speak. See you soon. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Atlanta to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.